They believed he got lost in the mountains until a GoPro found by a hiker played his last MA. The air in the ranger station was thick with the smell of stale coffee and damp wool, a scent that clung to the pine-paneled walls like a ghost. Outside, the Cascade Mountains clawed at a bruised purple twilight sky, their peaks dusted with the first stubborn snows of late autumn. For 3 days, this room had been the epicenter of a quiet, gnawing dread. Arthur Jacobson, 78 years old, a retired history professor with a fondness for birdwatching and a recently diagnosed heart condition, was missing. The official narrative was simple, a sad but familiar mountain story. An old man, perhaps a little confused, had wandered off the well-marked trail to chase a fleeting glimpse of a varied thrush, and the wilderness, in its patient, indifferent way, had swallowed him whole. Search and rescue teams, a mix of grim-faced professionals and earnest volunteers, had combed the area, their bright orange vests like scattered petals against the forest's deep green. They found a single, scuffed hiking boot wedged between 2 granite boulders a half-mile from the main path. Nothing else. By the 4th day, the search was being scaled back. The window of survival had slammed shut. The conversations in the ranger station shifted from rescue to recovery. The Jacobson family, a son from Seattle, a daughter from Portland, their faces etched with a grief that was already settling into the weary shape of acceptance, had being gently told to prepare for the worst. That was when a young hiker named Chloe, a college student with bright, curious eyes and a perpetually sunburned nose, walked into the station. She held a small, mud-caked object in her palm, as if it were a wounded bird.
Ice.
"Ah, I found this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She'd been on a lower, less-traveled trail, exploring a creek bed, when she saw a flash of black plastic snagged on a tangle of roots at the water's edge. It was a GoPro, its lens miraculously intact. Though the casing was scarred with deep gouges, the lead ranger, a man named Dave Heston, whose leathery face had been carved by 2 decades of mountain sun and sorrow, took it from her. He recognized the model. It was the same one Arthur Jacobson's son had described his father carrying a gift from the previous Christmas. Arthur had been meticulously documenting the local flora and fauna for a personal project. "Where did you find this?" "Exactly?" Heston asked, his voice tight with a sudden, unwelcome surge of adrenaline. Chloe pointed to a spot on the large topographical map pinned to the wall, a location miles downstream from where the boot had been discovered. It made no sense. The current in that creek was gentle. It couldn't have carried the camera that far. A knot of quiet anticipation formed in the room. The Jacobson family, who had been numbly signing paperwork, looked up. The air crackled. Heston carried the GoPro to a charging station in the back office, his movements deliberate, almost reverential. He cleaned the mud from the ports with a careful thumb, plugged it in, and waited. The small red charging light blinked on, a tiny electric pulse in the suffocating silence. An hour later, the battery had enough life. Heston connected the camera to a large monitor on the wall, the same one they used for weather briefings and training videos. He clicked on the media folder. There were dozens of video files, neatly labeled by date. Most were short, serene clips. A chipmunk scurrying over a mossy log, the delicate unfurling of a fern frond, a panoramic sweep of a sun-drenched valley. Arthur Jacobson's voice, a gentle academic baritone, narrated some of them with quiet delight. "Ah, look at that." His voice would murmur over a shot of a Steller's J, Cyanosider stellari. "Such a magnificent crest. A true king of the forest." The family watched, tears welling in their eyes. It was like getting him back, just for a moment. His son Mark managed a weak, watery smile. "That was Dad, always." The Professor Heston kept clicking through the files, moving toward the most recent ones, dated the day Arthur disappeared. The footage grew less steady. The serene pans were replaced by jerky, handheld shots. The audio was mostly the crunch of leaves underfoot and Arthur's own increasingly labored breathing. He was off the trail now, moving through dense, unfamiliar undergrowth. Should have stayed on the path, Old Man Arthur muttered to himself in one clip. A brief, shaky shot of his own tired face, beaded with sweat. Pride goeth before a fall, and all that. The mood in the room tensed. This was it. These were his last hours. Heston's finger hovered over the final file. It was much longer than the others, nearly 15 minutes. The timestamp showed it was recorded late in the afternoon, just as the light would have been starting to fail. He clicked play. The video that flickered to life. On the screen was a nightmare. The camera was on the ground, pointing up from a bed of damp leaves. The sky above was a chaotic canopy of branches, swaying violently. The audio was a cacophony of panicked, ragged breaths. Arthur's breaths and another sound, a low, guttural growl that was not animal. It was human. Please, Arthur's voice rasped, thin and reedy with terror. Please, just let me go. I won't tell anyone, I promise. A shadow fell over the lens. A boot, a heavy military-style combat boot. Not a hiking boot stamped down hard on the earth, just inches from the camera. Then a voice, cold and flat, sliced through the air. Old man, you should have stayed home. The camera jostled as if kicked. It rolled, capturing a blurred, sickening glimpse of two figures. One was Arthur, on his knees, his face pale and bloodless, his hands held up in a pleading gesture. The other was a younger man, his face obscured by shadow and the angle of the camera. But his silhouette was sharp, imposing. He wore dark tactical-style clothing. I have money, Arthur stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. In my wallet, and my watch. It's a good watch, a Tissot, you can have it. Just please. The second man laughed, a short, ugly bark, devoid of humor. I don't want your watch, Professor. He knelt down, his face coming into the frame, but it was distorted. A grotesque fun house mirror image captured by the wide-angle lens. All that was clear were his eyes, chillingly empty, and a cruel twist to his lips. He reached out and patted Arthur's cheek, a gesture of mocking, terrifying intimacy. What I want, the man said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, is for you to understand something. Some places are not for you. Some things are not for you to see. The room was utterly silent. The Jacobson family stared at the screen, their faces masks of disbelief and horror. Mark's hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists, his breath hitched in his throat. This wasn't the story of a man lost to the wilderness. This was a murder. On the screen, Arthur began to weep, quiet, desperate sobs that shook his frail body. I don't understand. I didn't see anything. I was just birdwatching. You saw the camp, the man said, his voice hardening. You saw the delivery. Bad luck, old man. Wrong place, wrong time. He stood up, his tall frame blocking out the sky. But we can't have loose ends. You know how it is. He turned and spoke to someone out of frame. Get the shovel. A third voice, younger, more hesitant, replied. Jesus, man, is this necessary? He's just an old guy. He's a witness, the first man snapped, his voice echoing with absolute authority. And witnesses disappear. Now get the goddamn shovel. We're behind schedule. The camera's view was now of Arthur's face, a landscape of pure, unadulterated terror. His eyes, wide and swimming with tears, were looking directly into the lens, as if pleading with the future, with whoever might find this recording. He knew he was going to die. The sound of metal scraping against rock grated from the speakers. Then, a new figure entered the frame, a younger man, barely out of his teens. His face a mess of conflicting emotions, fear, reluctance, and a desperate desire to please the first man. He was holding a small, foldable entrenching tool. He couldn't look at Arthur, his eyes were fixed on the ground. Now, hold him down, the first man commanded. The video feed suddenly lurched, the world spun in a nauseating blur of green and brown. There was the sound of a struggle, a muffled cry from Arthur, and then a sickening wet thud. And another, and another. The audio was horrific, a soundtrack of brutal final violence, mixed with the younger man's panicked breathing, and the first man's cold, emotionless grunts of exertion. The screen showed nothing but a close-up of trampled leaves and dark, damp earth. But the sounds The sounds painted a picture more vivid and horrifying than any image could. Finally, it stopped. The only sound for a long, agonizing moment was the heavy, gasping breaths of the two men. "See," the first man's voice said, eerily calm, clean, efficient. "Now, let's get him buried. Deep, no markers." His shadow moved across the lens again. "And find his damn camera." He was filming everything. The video feed shook violently. There was a fumbling sound, then a curse. "I can't find it. It must have rolled away when he fell." "Then look harder," the first man roared, his voice cracking with sudden fury. "Find it now." The final 30 seconds of the recording were a frantic, chaotic search. The camera's perspective shifted wildly as unseen hands tore through the underbrush around it. Leaves and dirt flew past the lens. The two men's curses grew more desperate. And then, a final jarring kick. The camera was sent flying, tumbling, through the air in a dizzying arc before landing with a splash in the dark, gurgling water of the creek. The image stabilized, half submerged. The world was a split screen of murky water and the indifferent, darkening sky. The audio was muffled, just the gentle lapping of the current against the casing. The voices of the two men faded into the distance, their panicked shouts swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence of the forest. The video file ended. The screen went black. For a full minute, the only sound in the ranger station was the hum of the monitor. No one moved, no one breathed. The gentle, sad story of an elderly hiker lost to the elements had been ripped away, replaced by a snuff film, a raw, unfiltered recording of a brutal, senseless execution. Arthur Jacobson's daughter let out a low, guttural wail, a sound of such profound primal grief that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. Her brother, Mark, stood frozen, his face a pale, sweat-slicked mask of rage and disbelief. He looked from the blank screen to Ranger Heston, his eyes burning with a question that was also a demand. Heston himself felt a cold dread coiling in his gut. He had worked in these mountains for 20 years. He had seen tragedy, accidents, the cruel indifference of nature. But this was different. This was a monster. 2 of them. And they were still out there. They had a camp. They were waiting for a delivery. This wasn't just a murder. It was something bigger, something organized. Something that had brought a darkness into his forest that felt ancient and deeply wrong. He looked at the topographical map on the wall, his eyes tracing the path of the creek where the GoPro had been found. He thought of the boot, discovered miles away in the opposite direction. Deliberate misdirection, a piece of the puzzle placed to send them all looking in the wrong place. These weren't just killers, they were smart, they were methodical, and they had left behind a witness. Not a person, but a small, black, plastic box. A ghost in the machine. A final, desperate message from a dead man. The cliffhanger wasn't what would happen next. The cliffhanger was the chilling, unspoken realization that was slowly dawning on every person in that room. The killers knew they had lost the camera. They knew there was a recording of what they had done. And for the last 4 days, while the search teams had been combing the wrong side of the mountain, they had been doing their own frantic searching. Not for a man, but for the evidence of their crime. And they hadn't found it. Which meant they were still looking. They were still here. Somewhere in the vast, darkening wilderness that surrounded them. The monsters were listening, and they were hunting. The victim was Arthur Jacobson, but he was more than just a name on a missing person report. To understand the quiet dignity that had been so brutally extinguished, you had to go back 6 months before the GoPro's final, terrible recording. You had to see him in his element, in the sun-dappled study of his small, book-crammed house on the outskirts of town. The room smelled of old paper, lemon polish, and the faint, sweet scent of the pipe tobacco he'd given up years ago, but whose ghost still lingered in the velvet curtains. Here, he was not a victim. He was a curator of small wonders. His life's work, post-retirement, was a meticulous, self-published encyclopedia he called the Unseen Kingdom of the Cascades. It wasn't for fame or money, it was for his grandchildren. a legacy written in observations rather than assets. He'd spend hours at his large oak desk, a magnifying glass in one hand, a delicate bird's feather or a piece of interesting lichen in the other. His hands, gnarled with arthritis, moved with a surgeon's precision as he'd sketched the specimen in a leather-bound journal, his fountain pen scratching softly across the thick, creamy paper. His wife, Eleanor, had died 3 years prior, and the silence she left behind was a physical presence in the house. Arthur had filled it not with noise, but with purpose. The encyclopedia was his conversation with her, a continuation of the long, rambling walks they used to take. "You see, Ellie?" he'd murmur to the empty room, holding a photograph of a mountain bluebird up to the light. "The male's cerulean is simply astonishing in the morning sun. It's as if a piece of the sky fell down and decided to sing." This gentle solitude was his armor against the creeping fear of his own mortality. His doctor, a brisk nonsense woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, had sat him down after his last checkup. The echocardiogram was not good. "Arthur," she'd said, her pen tapping a rhythm of concern on his file, "your heart is working too hard, the walls are thickening. I want you to take it easy. No strenuous hiking, stick to the flat trails, and for God's sake, carry your phone and a GPS beacon." Arthur had nodded, a placid smile on his face, while inside, a quiet rebellion brewed. He hated the idea of being tethered, of being managed. The mountains were his last bastion of freedom, a place where he was not an old man with a failing heart, but an explorer, a scholar of the wild. The GoPro had been a compromise, a gift from his son, Mark. "If you're going to go off trail, Dad, at least film it," Mark had pleaded. "That way, if you get lost, we can see where you went, and we'll get to see all the cool stuff you find." Arthur had agreed, mostly to appease him. He found the technology cumbersome, a barrier between him and the raw experience of nature. But he'd dutifully learned to use it, and in time, he'd even grown fond of it, another tool for his scholarship. It was this tool, this concession, to his family's worry, that would ultimately sign his death warrant. The antagonist, the man with the cold, flat voice and the military boots, was named Caleb Thorne. Thorne was not a product of the mountains, he was an infection within them. He'd grown up in a series of bleak, forgotten mill towns in the Rust Belt, places where hope had been boarded up. Along with the factories, his father was a specter, his mother a ghost lost to opioids. The only constant in his life was the gnawing hunger of neglect. He found his first family in the army, a place where his simmering rage could be channeled, honed, and given a uniform. He excelled in the ranges, thriving in the harsh, uncompromising logic of combat. He was a good soldier, too good. He saw things, did things, in the dusty landscapes of Afghanistan, that scraped away what little softness he had left. When he was discharged, honorably, but with a quiet suggestion that he might not be suited for peacetime command, he came back to a country he no longer recognized. He was a weapon without a war. He drifted, working private security gigs, bouncing at backwater bars. The coiled violence within him, always looking for a release. He found it in a man who called himself the Colonel, a charismatic but ruthless operator who ran a sophisticated drug trafficking network through the remote, unpatrolled wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest. The Colonel didn't want thugs, he wanted soldiers. He wanted discipline, logistics, and the ability to operate unseen. He wanted Caleb Thorne. Thorne was given command of a small mobile unit. Their job was to establish hidden waypoints, secure landing zones for low planes, and move high-value product through the mountains to distribution hubs in the city. He was good at it. He ran his crew like an infantry squad, strict light and noise discipline, encrypted communications, ruthless efficiency. The wilderness was his new theater of operations, and he was its undisputed commander. He felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since the war. This was his kingdom, and he would defend its borders with lethal force. The hidden witness, the boy with the shovel, was named Seth. Seth was barely 19, a local kid from the depressed logging town. At the foot of the mountains, he was all raw angles and nervous energy, a boy trying desperately to wear the mask of a man. His father had lost a hand in a sawmill accident, and the family fortune, such as it was, in the bottom of a whiskey bottle. Seth's future was a cul-de-sac. The mill, the army, or the meth pipe. Thorne had found him working at a gas station, his eyes holding a familiar mix of desperation and untapped potential. Thorne didn't offer him a job, he offered him a mission. He spoke of brotherhood, of taking back control, of being part of something elite. To Seth, who had never been part of anything but his family's slow-motion collapse, Thorne was a savior. He was strong, confident, and utterly in control. Seth idolized him. He would have done anything for him. The first few months were a thrill. Seth learned to read a topographical map, to set up a concealed campsite, to handle a rifle. He felt strong, capable. Thorne was a demanding but patient teacher, a twisted father figure, providing the structure Seth's own father never could. They were a team, a unit. They were ghosts in the forest, moving with a secret, shared purpose. He ignored the gnawing voice in the back of his mind that told him they were just drug mules, cogs in a machine that was poisoning towns just like his. He pushed it down because the alternative, going back to the gas station, to the smell of stale beer on his father's breath, was unthinkable. The intersection of these three lives was a catastrophic accident of timing. On that crisp autumn afternoon, Arthur Jacobson, following the melodic call of a Townsend's warbler, strayed further from the path than he ever had before. His heart was fluttering, a warning sign he chose to ignore, and he sat down on a fallen log to catch his breath, fumbling with the GoPro to capture the fading light through the canopy. That's when he heard the low hum. It wasn't a bee, it was a drone. He watched, fascinated, as the small dark shape descended into a clearing, not 50 yards from where he sat. He saw two men in dark clothing emerge from the trees, unhook a package, and replace it with another. It was quiet, efficient, and deeply strange. Arthur, the eternal scholar, was overcome with curiosity. He thought perhaps they were university researchers, or maybe a government survey team. He raised the GoPro, its lens a silent, unblinking eye, and filmed the exchange. He didn't realize his mistake until one of the men looked up, his eyes, even from that distance, seeming to lock directly onto him. It was Thorne, and in that moment, Arthur Jacobson's fate was sealed. He was no longer a birdwatcher, he was a loose end. The confrontation, as captured on the GoPro, was the brutal collision of these three worlds. Thorne, the predator whose territory had been breached, moved with cold, practiced violence. Arthur, the gentle scholar, was suddenly faced with a brand of human cruelty he had only ever read about in history books. And Seth, the boy who wanted to be a soldier, was handed a shovel and given his final, terrible order. The scene that the GoPro didn't fully capture was the one that would haunt Seth for the rest of his life. After Thorne's initial brutal blows with the shovel, Arthur was not dead. He was lying on the ground, his body broken, a gurgling sound coming from his throat. His eyes were open, and they were fixed on Seth. They were not angry, they were not hateful. They were filled with a deep, bottomless pity. It was the look of a grandfather gazing upon a lost, broken child. "He's still breathing," Seth whispered, his voice shaking. The shovel felt impossibly heavy in his hands. Thorne, wiping a smear of blood from his cheek with the back of his glove, didn't even look down. "Then fix it." It was a command, an initiation, a final test of loyalty. Seth stood there, frozen, the old man's pitying gaze burning into him. He saw his own father's face, his own reflection in the grimy gas station window, the dead end of his life stretching out before him. Thorne was his only way out, and the price of that escape was the last of his soul. He raised the shovel. He closed his eyes, and he brought it down. When it was over, Thorne clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of grim approval. "Good work, kid. You're one of us now." But, as they frantically searched for the missing camera, a cold, sickening realization washed over Seth. He wasn't one of them. He was just another tool, as disposable as the shovel in his hand. The look in Arthur's eyes would be seared into his memory, a silent, damning testament to the boy he had been and the monster he had just become. And the lost GoPro, somewhere in the dark, rushing water of the creek, was a ticking time bomb. waiting to tell the world not just how Arthur Jacobson died, but how Seth's own humanity had died with him. The discovery of the GoPro video sent a shockwave through the small mountain community, but for Caleb Thorne, it was a declaration of war. He and Seth had made it back to their primary base camp, a cleverly concealed cluster of yurts deep in the national forest, just before dawn on the day after the murder. The mood was grim. "The camera is gone," Thorne stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion as he addressed the half-dozen other men in his unit. They were all ex-military, hard men with haunted eyes, drawn to the colonel's operation for the money and the mission. It recorded everything. Assume it's a worst-case scenario. Assume it will be found. Seth stood at the edge of the group, his hands shoved in his pockets, his face pale. He hadn't slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Arthur Jacobson's face, heard the wet thud of the shovel. Thorne's gaze fell on him, cold and sharp. "You, Seth, you were closest to him. What did you see?" I don't know," Seth stammered. "It was on the ground. When he fell, it must have rolled. We looked everywhere." Thorne stepped closer, invading Seth's personal space. The smell of pine and cold sweat radiated from him. "Did you look in the creek?" "It was dark. We couldn't see anything." "Incompetence," Thorne hissed, the word a slap in the face. "You let a piece of evidence that could burn this entire operation to the ground get washed away by a fucking stream." He turned to the others. "For the last 3 days, SAR has been searching the wrong grid. Thanks to the boot we planted. That gave us a window. That window is now closed. The camera is our primary threat. The official search for the old man is over. Our search begins." The injustice escalated with a chilling, calculated cruelty. Thorne's first move was to control the narrative. He knew the local sheriff, a man named Bill Henderson, was a plodding, unimaginative cop who was easily intimidated. Using a burner phone, Thorne made an anonymous call to the sheriff's office. "I'm a hiker," he said, his voice disguised with a cheap voice-altering app. "I was up near Black Creek Ridge a few days ago. Saw that old fella who went missing. He was way off the trail, talking to himself, seemed confused, delirious. Said something about going to see the angels. Sad stuff." It was a small, vicious lie, but it was effective. It reinforced the official story, painting Arthur as a senile old man who had wandered to his death. It was a desecration of his memory, a smear of mud on the legacy of a man who had been nothing but gentle and lucid. When Ranger Heston brought the GoPro to Sheriff Henderson, the sheriff was already primed for skepticism. "So, a kid finds this thing miles away from the search area," Henderson said, leaning back in his creaky office chair, his gut straining the buttons of his uniform. "And it shows what's some kind of struggle. Dave, we've all seen what a bear can do to a person. It's ugly." "This wasn't a bear, Bill," Heston insisted, his voice tight with frustration. "You heard the voices. They talked about a camp, a delivery. This is organized. This is a homicide. Or, it's a hoax," Henderson countered, waving a dismissive hand. "Some kids with a GoPro and a sick sense of humor. We get it all the time. You know how much overtime this would cost me? To launch a full-blown murder investigation based on some grainy video, the county would have my badge." The betrayal was a punch to the gut for Heston and the Jacobson family. The one institution that was supposed to deliver justice was actively refusing to see the truth. The official cause of death remained missing, presumed deceased due to environmental exposure. The case was effectively closed before it was ever opened. Thorne, monitoring the local news and police chatter through a scanner, allowed himself a small, cold smile. The system was working for him. But he wasn't leaving anything to chance. He knew the camera was still out there. He and his men began a meticulous, covert search of the creek and its banks. Disguised as fishermen or backpackers, their eyes scanning the water, the roots, the rocks. The pressure on Seth was relentless. Thorne made him the point man for the search, a daily punishment for his failure. Every morning, he was sent back to the area where he had taken a man's life. Forced to relive the horror, to walk the ground where Arthur's blood had soaked into the earth. You lost it, you find it, Thorn would say, his voice a low threat. Or maybe you'd like to take his place at the bottom of that hole. Seth's fear was a constant, metallic taste in his mouth. He was trapped. He couldn't go to the police. He was an accomplice to murder. He couldn't run. Thorn had made it clear that desertion was a capital offense in his unit. He saw Thorn's casual brutality firsthand a week after the murder. One of the other men, a former Marine named Diaz, voiced his concern about the risk. "This is too hot, man," Diaz said, his voice low. "A civilian witness. That's not what we signed up for." The colonel wouldn't approve. Thorn didn't raise his voice. He simply walked over to Diaz, who was cleaning his rifle by the fire. "You questioning my orders, soldier?" "I'm questioning the risk," Diaz said, standing his ground. Thorn's movement was a blur. He grabbed the hot barrel of Diaz's rifle and shoved it upward, pinning it under Diaz's chin. The smell of searing flesh filled the air. Diaz screamed, a choked, gargling sound. "The colonel put me in charge." Thorn snarled, his face inches from Diaz's, "and my orders are the only ones that matter. The only risk here is the one you're taking by breathing my air. Do you understand me?" Diaz, tears of agony streaming down his face, could only nod. Seth watched, his stomach churning. This was the man he had thrown his life away for. This was the brotherhood he had been promised. It was a cult of fear, with Thorn as its unhinged, violent god. Arthur's son, Mark, was also facing a wall of institutional indifference. He was a software engineer, a man who believed in data, in logic. The video was irrefutable proof. Yet, the authorities refused to act. He hired a private investigator, a grizzled ex-cop, who took his money. Spent 2 days making cursory inquiries, and came back with a shrug. "Son, there's nothing here," the pie said. "The sheriff's not playing ball. Without a body, without a weapon, all you've got is a video that could be anything. My advice, let it go. Mourn your father." Mark couldn't let it go. The image of his father on his knees, begging for his life, was burned into his mind. He became obsessed. He quit his job, moved into a cheap motel near the mountains, and started his own investigation. He bought hiking gear, topographical maps, a drone of his own. He was clumsy, an amateur in a world he didn't understand. But he was driven by a righteous, all-consuming fury. He posted stills from the video on online forums, pleading for help. Does anyone recognize these men? This location? The responses were a mix of sympathy, crackpot theories, and cruel trolling. The injustice was not just that his father had been murdered, but that the world seemed determined to forget him. One evening, Mark was hiking back to his car after a fruitless day of searching, when he saw a figure watching him from the tree line. It was a young man, thin and nervous-looking. As Mark approached, the figure melted back into the woods. It was Seth. Thorn had tasked him with monitoring the grieving son, making sure he didn't get too close to their operations. Seth's conscience, the small part of him that hadn't been crushed by fear, was screaming. He saw the raw grief and determination on Mark's face, and it was like looking at a mirror image of his own guilt. He knew he held the key. He knew the location of the camp. He knew Thorn's name. But to speak would be to sign his own death warrant. He was caught in an impossible position. A ghost haunting the edges of the tragedy he had helped create. The conflict reached its peak a month after the murder. Thorn, frustrated by the fruitless search for the GoPro, decided on a new, terrifyingly bold strategy. He would burn the evidence, all of it. "The forest is too big," he announced to his crew one night. "We'll never find that camera. So, we're going to erase the crime scene, all of it." He planned to start a forest fire, a controlled burn, he called it, that would rage through the sector where Arthur had been killed, destroying any potential evidence that might remain: blood, fibers, footprints, and, if they were lucky, the camera itself. It was a scorched earth policy breathtaking in its arrogance and disregard for the consequences. A fire in these dry, late-season conditions could easily burn out of control. threatening the town, the lives of firefighters. Everything. Thorne didn't care. The operation was his only concern. Seth was horrified. This was a line he never imagined crossing. Murder was one thing, a secret buried in the woods, but this was an act of mass destruction, a potential catastrophe. We can't do that, Seth said, his voice barely a whisper. People could get hurt. The whole mountain could go up. Thorne turned to him, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. You're getting a real conscience on you, kid. He walked over and put a heavy arm around Seth's shoulders. Don't worry, you're going to be the one to light the match. It's a promotion. You're moving up in the world. It was the ultimate act of cruelty, forcing Seth to become the agent of the very destruction he feared. The conflict was no longer just about a hidden camera or a secret camp. It was about the soul of the forest itself and the escalating madness of the man who sought to dominate it. And for Seth, the struggle was no longer between fear and conscience, but between certain death at Thorne's hand and a monstrous act that would put countless innocent lives at risk. The tension was no longer just rising, it was about to explode. The plot twist didn't come from a dusty archive or a forgotten file, it came from the sky. Mark Jacobson, in his grief-fueled obsession, had spent thousands of dollars on a professional-grade drone, one with a higher-resolution thermal imaging camera. For weeks, he'd been systematically flying grid patterns over the national forest, comparing the heat signatures he recorded at night with satellite maps from during the day. He was looking for anomalies, for anything that didn't belong. He was looking for a ghost. He was sitting in his cramped motel room, the drone's controller linked to his laptop, when he found it. It was 3 a.m., the air thick with the smell of stale pizza and despair. On the screen, in a remote, densely wooded area, miles from any official trail, was a cluster of faint, geometric heat signatures. They were too uniform for a natural feature, too organized for a random campsite, yurts, 5 of them, arranged in a defensive perimeter. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. This had to be the camp his father's murderer had talked about. He cross-referenced the GPS coordinates with the GoPro video. He analyzed the angle of the sun in the footage, the species of trees, the topography of the distant ridges. It was a match. The clearing where his father had been executed was less than a mile from the camp. He had found their nest, but what could he do? The sheriff had already dismissed him. He was just a civilian with a drone. He needed more. He needed irrefutable proof, something that would force the authorities to act. He needed a voice from the inside. That voice belonged to Seth. The order to start the forest fire had shattered the last remnants of his loyalty to Thorne. He was a cornered animal, looking for any way out. The night before the planned arson, he did something desperate. He stole one of the unit's encrypted satellite phones. He didn't know who to call. The police were a death sentence. He was scrolling through the contacts, a list of codenames and numbers, when he saw a name he recognized, Diaz, the man Thorne had brutally burned. Diaz had been medevaced out by the colonel's people, his career with the unit over. Seth remembered the look of hatred in Diaz's eyes as he was carried away. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. He found a secluded spot, his hands trembling as he dialed. Diaz picked up on the 3rd ring. His voice was hoarse, bitter. Who is this? It's Seth, the kid from Thorne's unit. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. You've got a lot of nerve calling me, boy. I know, Seth said, his voice cracking. But he's lost it. He's gone. Completely insane. He's planning to burn down half the national forest tomorrow to cover up the old man's murder. Diaz, he's going to get us all killed or put away for life. Another silence. Seth could hear the pain in Diaz's breathing. What do you want from me? I need a way out, Seth pleaded. I need to talk to someone. Someone who can stop him. Someone who isn't the local cops. Diaz was quiet for a moment. He had no love for Thorne, and even less for the colonel's operation, which had cast him aside like a broken tool. There's a woman, he said finally, his voice low. FBI agent Miller. She's been building a case against the colonel for years. She's smart, she's relentless, but she doesn't have enough to move on him. She needs someone on the inside. He gave Seth a number. Tell her everything. Tell her Diaz sent you. And pray to God she believes you. The stakes had just shifted seismically. This was no longer about a single murder. It was about bringing down a multi-state drug trafficking ring. Seth was no longer just a witness to a crime. He was the key to unlocking a massive federal investigation. He made the call. FBI Special Agent Isabella Miller was everything Diaz had said. She was sharp, incisive, and she listened without judgment as Seth's confession poured out of him: the murder, the camp, the drugs, the plan to start the fire. She didn't make promises she couldn't keep. You're in a lot of trouble, Seth, she said, her voice calm and steady through the satellite connection. You're an accessory to murder. But you're also my only way inside. If you cooperate, if you help me take Thorne and the Colonel down, I can make sure the U.S. Attorney knows you're the reason the case was made. It's the only chance you have. The conspiracy began to unfurl. Miller, working with a federal warrant, got access to the Colonel's financial records. He wasn't just a drug runner, he was a prominent real estate developer in Seattle, a man who moved in the highest circles of power, laundering his money through legitimate businesses. He was untouchable, protected by a wall of lawyers and political connections. The drugs were only part of his enterprise. He was also using his network to smuggle weapons and other contraband. Thorne's unit was his private army, enforcing his will in the wild, ungoverned spaces where his empire began. The hidden clue that tied it all together came not from Seth, but from Arthur Jacobson's own meticulous research. While Mark was preparing to hand his drone footage over to the FBI, he was also going through his father's journals, the beautiful, handwritten volumes of the Unseen Kingdom. Tucked into a pocket at the back of the most recent volume was a small folded piece of paper. On it, Arthur had sketched the drone he had seen, and beneath it, a series of numbers he had managed to read off its casing before he was discovered. It was a serial number. When Agent Miller ran the number through the FAA's drone registration database, she hit the jackpot. The drone was registered not to some anonymous shell corporation, but to a holding company directly owned by the Colonel's real estate firm. It was the physical link she needed, the thread that connected the untouchable billionaire in his Seattle penthouse to the brutal murder of an old man in the woods. The drone wasn't just for delivering packages, it was for surveillance, for command and control. Arthur hadn't just stumbled upon a drug deal, he had stumbled upon the nerve center of the entire operation. The tension cranked to its absolute maximum. Miller now had 3 critical pieces of evidence: the GoPro video showing the murder, Mark's drone footage pinpointing the camp's location, and Seth's testimony from the inside. And she had a ticking clock. Thorne was planning to set the fire at dusk the next day. "We're going in," Miller announced to her tactical team. "But we have to do this smart. Thorne is ex-ranger. His camp will have sentries, tripwires, a clear field of fire. A direct assault is a suicide mission." The plan was audacious, relying on the one person Thorne would never suspect. Seth, Miller said over the encrypted line, "I need you to do one last thing. I need you to go through with it. I need you to light the fire." Seth's blood ran cold. "What? You want me to?" "Thorne will be watching you," Miller explained, her voice a low, urgent hum. "It's a test. If you refuse, he'll kill you, and we lose our only advantage. We need him to feel confident. We need him to feel in control. You will go to the ignition point. You will have a device I'm going to provide you. When you activate it, it will send a silent signal to my team, and it will also create a small, contained flight. Enough to convince Thorne the fire has been started. At that exact moment, my teams will move in from 3 sides. He'll be looking at the fire, not at his flanks. It's the only way to take them by surprise." It was a terrifying gamble. Seth would be standing at ground zero, a human Judas goat, with a sociopathic killer watching his every move. His survival depended on the FBI's perfect timing and his own ability to play the part of a loyal soldier one last time. The stage was set for a final explosive confrontation in the heart of the darkening forest. The personal pain of the Jacobson family was about to ignite a public scandal that would burn all the way to the top. The cinematic payoff was not a courtroom bombshell, but a silent, deadly ballet conducted in the twilight cathedral of the forest. The air was cold and still, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. From a ridge overlooking the planned ignition point, Caleb Thorne watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars, a predator observing his domain. Below, he could see Seth, a small solitary figure, moving toward a pile of tinder and dry brush. That had been soaked in accelerant. Seth's heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. In his pocket, his hand was wrapped around the device Agent Miller had given him. It was the size of a Zippo lighter, cold and heavy. One button for the flare, one button for the silent GPS burst that would trigger the raid. He felt Thorne's eyes on him, a physical weight on his back. He had to make this look real. He knelt, his movements deliberately clumsy, feigning nervousness. He pulled out a box of matches, his hand shaking for real this time. He struck one. The tiny flame wavered. In the gloom, he held it to the tinder dot as the flame touched the brush. He squeezed the device in his pocket. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, a brilliant, white-hot flare erupted from the pile. A silent explosion of light that shot 20 feet into the air. It was a chemical reaction, designed to burn intensely for a few seconds and then die. But from Thorne's vantage point, it looked like the start of a raging inferno. He smiled, a thin, cruel line. The kid had come through. The evidence was being erased. It was the last thing he ever saw clearly from the trees behind him. A shadow detached itself from the deepening gloom. There was no sound, no warning. A hand clamped over Thorne's mouth, and a knife, honed to a razor's edge, drew a swift, deep line across his throat. He dropped the binoculars, his hands flying to the gushing wound, a look of pure animal shock in his eyes. He crumpled to the ground, his life bleeding out into the pine needles. His reign as king of the forest ending in a silent, gurgling whisper. The FBI hostage rescue team did not make arrests when dealing with armed military-trained hostiles in the wilderness. They neutralized threats. Simultaneously, two other tactical teams, moving with the ghostly quiet of wraiths, converged on the yurt camp. The sentries, their attention diverted by the flare, were taken down with suppressed weapons before they could even raise an alarm. The rest of Thorne's unit, gathered in the main yurt to watch the distant fire, were caught completely by surprise. The door burst open, flashbang grenades rolled across the floor, and the world dissolved into a blinding white light and a deafening roar. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Down below, Seth scrambled away from the dying flare, his lungs heaving. He saw figures moving in the trees, heard the whispered commands on their radios. He dropped to his knees, his hands in the air. Just as Agent Miller and two heavily armed agents emerged from the woods. "It's over," Seth Miller said, her voice calm but her eyes scanning the perimeter, her weapons still at the ready. "You did it." The public exposure was explosive. The next morning, news channels broke the story not of a forest fire, but of a massive federal raid. The headlines were sensational. Billionaire developer, the Colonel, arrested as drug kingpin. FBI smashes wilderness smuggling ring. Hikers, GoPro, video cracks case of murdered professor. The arrest of the Colonel was a media circus. He was perp-walked out of his gleaming Seattle skyscraper, his face a mask of arrogant disbelief, trading his $1,000 suit for an orange jumpsuit. The story had everything. A murdered, gentle old man. A secret army of a corrupt billionaire living a double life. It was a scandal that broke the internet. The most powerful moment, the scene that played on a loop on every news broadcast, came from Mark Jacobson. He had been with Agent Miller's team, waiting at their command post, when they brought Seth in. Mark stood there, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, as he looked at the terrified boy who had helped kill his father. Seth wouldn't look at him. He just stared at the ground, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Look at me," Mark said, His voice low and shaking with rage, Seth slowly raised his head. His eyes were filled with a shame so profound it was almost a physical entity. "My father was a good man," Mark said, his voice breaking. "He loved these mountains. He loved the birds, the trees, everything. He wouldn't have hurt anyone." He took a step closer, and, for a moment, it looked like he might strike the boy. Instead, he stopped, his fists clenched at his sides. "Why?" he whispered. "Just why?" Seth's confession was not an excuse, but a raw, unfiltered torrent of fear and regret. He told Mark about his life, about Thorn, about the shovel, about the look in Arthur's eyes. He wept, not for himself, but for the man he had killed. "He looked at me." Seth choked out, the words tearing from his throat. "And he wasn't angry. He just looked. Sorry for me." It was this moment, captured by a news crew's long-distance lens, that became the emotional core of the story. It wasn't just about justice. It was about the collision of innocence and corruption, and the tragic human cost of Thorn's war. The final, poetic twist of fate was reserved for the GoPro. During the evidence sweep of the camp, an agent found it. Thorn had eventually found it. After weeks of searching the creek, one of his men had spotted it, and Thorn had kept it in his personal yurt, a trophy, a reminder of his power and his contempt for the old man he had murdered. He would watch it sometimes, the FBI later learned, from a debriefing with one of the captured men, as a kind of private film, a testament to his own ruthlessness. The very evidence he thought he had controlled, the object he had killed to conceal and then recovered as a symbol of his victory, had been sitting in his yurt, a silent witness, while the FBI, guided by that same camera's legacy, closed in around him. The camera had not only started the investigation, it had, in a way, been present for its conclusion, a final silent observer to the fall of the man who thought he was a king. Justice wasn't just served, it was delivered with a chilling cinematic symmetry. The ghost in the machine had had the last laugh. The emotional aftermath was not one of clean, simple healing, but of haunting, bittersweet reflection. The trial of the colonel and the surviving members of Thorn's unit was a protracted, messy affair. The colonel's high-priced lawyers threw up a wall of obfuscation, but the evidence was overwhelming. The drone's serial number, the financial records, and most importantly, the raw, undeniable horror of the GoPro video, sealed their fates. Seth, as promised, received a plea deal for his cooperation. He was convicted of accessory to murder and sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. At his sentencing, he stood and faced Mark Jacobson, who sat in the front row of the courtroom every single day of the trial. I know saying sorry doesn't change anything," Seth said, his voice hollowed out, his youth seemingly erased. "But I want you to know that your father, he saved me. The way he looked at me, it's the only reason I'm not still out there. I'll live with what I did for the rest of my life, and I'll try to be a man he wouldn't be sorry for." Mark didn't nod. He didn't offer forgiveness. He simply watched, his face a mask of stone, the chasm between them too wide to ever be bridged. A year after the trial, Mark returned to the mountains. He went back to the place where his father had died. The forest was already healing itself. New growth was covering the scars of the investigation, the trampled earth, the yellow crime scene, tape, long since removed. He had expected to feel anger, or perhaps a sense of finality. Instead, he just felt a profound aching absence. He had brought something with him. It was a small, simple grave marker, carved from a piece of local granite. He had chiseled it himself. The words imperfect but heartfelt Arthur Jacobson, 1945 sampai 2023. He loved this muintia. He found a small sun-dappled clearing near the spot, a place with a view of the valley his father had so loved to film. As he set the stone in place, a bird landed on a branch nearby. It was a varied thrush, its orange breast a slash of brilliant color against the green. It sung a series of ethereal flute-like notes that echoed through the quiet woods. It was the very bird his father had been chasing on that final day. Tears streamed down Mark's face, hot and silent. They weren't tears of rage or sadness, but of connection. It felt like a message, a final, gentle greeting from his father. A reminder that while men like Thorn and the Colonel could bring darkness and death into the world, they could never truly extinguish the beauty. The mountain remembered, the birds remembered. He took out his own phone, not a GoPro, and recorded the thrush's song. It was a new kind of encyclopedia, a continuation of his father's work. The pain would never fully go away, but here, in the cathedral of his father's last love, he could begin to find a semblance of peace. The final scene of the story belongs to Agent Miller. She, too, had been changed by the case. It had made her career, but it had also left a scar. She kept the GoPro, not in an evidence locker, but on a shelf in her office. It was a reminder of the fragility of innocence, of the darkness that can hide in the most beautiful places. Sometimes, late at night, when the office was quiet, she would pick it up. She never watched the final video again. Instead, she would watch the earlier clips. Arthur's gentle voice narrating the flight of a hawk, his quiet delight at the discovery of a rare wildflower, the steady, loving gaze of his camera as he documented a world he found endlessly fascinating. It was a tragic reminder of the cost of truth. The camera had brought justice, but it had also captured the last, precious moments of a life that had been dedicated to seeing the small, quiet wonders of the world. And in the end, the most haunting echo was not the sound of the shovel or the shouts of the killers, but the gentle, academic voice of Professor Arthur Jacobson, describing the magnificent crest of a Steller's jay, a king of a forest that had, for a short, brutal time, been turned into a kingdom of monsters. The wilderness had endured, as it always does, but it now held the ghost of a good man, and the lingering, silent question of how many other stories lay buried beneath its beautiful, indifferent surface.